I'm Margot, and I'm going to start first with the talk. So my show is titled Elemental Alchemy, and I make ceramics concentration. So for my show, I decided to explore this technique called crystalline pottery, and it's essentially growing crystals on the piece while it's in the kiln. So the crystals form from a chemical reaction of silica and zinc oxide when the kiln reaches its maximum temperature. And then I use a controlled firing schedule to ramp the heat up and down to encourage the crystals to grow. It's a very technical and hard to control process, but when the pieces come out, they're amazing. So why? So I loved art ever since I was a kid. I loved painting and drawing. I loved to experiment and make little crafts. And I also loved to do science experiments and I even got crystal kits from Santa and chemistry kits. So when I discovered crystalline pottery, it felt like the perfect blend of both processes. I first discovered this process in Seagrove, North Carolina with my mom. We were on a road trip and we were traveling down the Pottery Highway, which is actually what the highway was called. And then we stopped into a lot of these shops, and this one really called my name, and it was called You Harry Crystalline Pottery. And I walked in, and I picked up a simple slab-made platter, and it was shimmering with delicate crystals, and it really intrigued me. And I really was curious how you could grow crystals on pottery. So I talked to the shop owner, and he gave me an introduction to the process. And I even met an OU grad who worked there and studied under Tom Bartel, so it just felt like it was a meant-to-be thing. So ever since then, I was determined to discover or to figure this process out. It's been very frustrating, and I've had small wins over time, and that's encouraged me to keep going. So in my show, I have a collection of crystalline pieces, and then I also have a few test tiles to talk about the process behind what I've been doing. So as you can see, these glazes are very runny, and that's why these test tiles have troughs at the bottom to catch them. So for each of these large pieces, I've had to create a glaze catcher for the piece to sit on so that when it's in the kiln, this glaze doesn't completely cover the shelf and ruin it. So I've attached those catchers on using a mixture of wood glue and alumina hydrate. And then if I was lucky, it would pop off in the kiln after it was done firing, and the mixture would prevent the two pieces from fusing together. And then I could grind the bottoms down and make it look nice. So I tried many applications of glaze. So I tried spraying, dipping, pouring, and brushing. And what I've come to discover is that the best combination is pouring and a layer of brushing glaze on. And I've also experimented with many different kiln schedules, tweaking things as I see the results and trying new things to get the crystals to grow. And I'm really proud it came together. About a week ago, I wasn't getting the results I was looking for, and then it wrapped up just in time. So I'm not going to talk about each piece in specific, but I do want to talk about, since they're just pots, but I want to talk about a few of the pieces that failed. So this centerpiece right here actually came out in a satin blue, and I refired it maybe 3 times to try and achieve that result, and tweaked the kiln schedule and the glaze application many times to figure out how to get it right, as well as this piece over here also came out in a matte satin blue, and I tried to refire it, and I was able to achieve those results. These pieces show part of the process, what worked and what didn't. For example, sorry, I'm making you run everywhere. Over here, this piece, you can see that the crystals didn't fully form on one side of it, and that could be due to many different factors. So I wanted to include a couple pieces to show that this isn't a perfect process. And next year, I will be staying at OU to get my master's in art education and pass on my love for ceramics. I first discovered it when I was in high school, and I owe my path that I'm on to my high school ceramics teacher, so I just want to give that back. And yeah, that's all I have.
Studies. I'm an honors student at college, and this thesis is a dual thesis towards my HTC senior thesis requirement. My talk is going to incorporate a lot of theory and history, because what's art without theory and history? It's titled Waterman Weft, which delves into a decade in the Indian colonial movement that, despite its brief duration, it occupies a very key chapter in the historiography of anti-colonialism and how India came to be a nation. This work interrogates the intersection of materiality and resistance, using clay as a medium to challenge the boundaries between artistic expression and social theory. There are two key philosophies that are guiding my work. One's a theory by bell hooks called Margins to Center, which privileges stories of people and communities that are excluded from the mainstream narrative of liberation movements. And the second philosophy is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. What you see here is reclamation of the spinning wheel. The spinning wheel was a key symbol in the Indian historical resistance movement. It symbolizes self-sufficiency and reliance on indigenous craftsmanship and self-producing your own economy. The decade that I was talking about is called Swadeshi movement, which stands for Swa means self and Desh means country. So it symbolizes how the people of a nation make the nation instead of the colonial administrative that was trying to impose the idea of nation on India. A brief historical background. In 1905, India's indigenous cotton industry was deindustrialized by, there was a ban on raw cotton being manufactured into textile. So the raw cotton in India would be shipped to English mills. They were manufactured into clothes and then sent it back to India with exorbitant taxes. Even though this might seem like a very typical thing that happens, what this leads to is lack of national pride, extreme dependency on colonial manufacturers, and a complete strip of nation building because you can't rely on your own economy anymore. The gaps in the current literature are that nobody has talked about the spinning wheel through an artistic lens. It's always been through an economic lens and what it did for the textile industry. But nobody has talked about the physical act of making your own cotton as a site of knowledge and like knowledge production, because the simple act of moving a wheel is imbuing your body with memory and knowledge, and that's what I'm looking at. I'm going to be continuing this research in my graduate work at the University of Cambridge, where me and my supervisor are going to be looking at labor and indigenous craftsmanship and ancient ethics work as a site of resistance. A little bit about my background and my journey with art. Art has enveloped every stage of my life, and it offered a space of safety for the gentle exploration of feelings in a complicated emotional landscape. While my artistic space was replete with a sense of safety and multiple forms and materials, I was craving for a deeper engagement with the world around me, with such profound injustices unfolding around me. I kept asking myself, how can my art be effective in my community, and what's even the point of creating if my creation doesn't do something to have a ripple effect in my community? Which is why creating art about historical things and having a sense of political commentary in my work is very important. As I said, the core philosophies of my work were margins to center. As we see here, the margins are highlighted and the center is kind of in the backdrop. I'm not trying to erase the center, but trying to highlight the margins. The margins mostly are brown people, queer people, and women, which is what I identify as like my personal identity. So there's a lot of like personal narrative in here. Instead of making one big spinning wheel, which what I was originally going to make, I resorted to making a bunch of smaller wheels to speak to the individual contributions that lead to a revolution instead of grand gestures and big political commentary. Almost to speak to little things that people can do on an everyday basis. One big part of the Swadeshi movement was boycott. And these are things that we see in today's narrative. Yeah, my artistic inquiry would be incomplete without my written work. So if you're interested in reading a book that I'm trying to publish, there's a QR code on my artistic statement that you can scan, and it will lead you to sort of a manuscript of what I've been working on over the last 2 years. In doing so, this work is confronting the present political landscape that insists on a Western idea of knowledge as being the only worthy site of understanding our narratives. There is so much erasure around marginalized stories, which is why this work is trying to specifically highlight the margins. I wanted to talk about the 4 key takeaways from my written theory portion. Oh, before that, I wanted to talk about the circular motif of this work. Circular motifs, like the wheel, are very central to Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. I am not trying to invoke a religious or nationalist narrative here. I'm trying to actively move away from that. But what I like about the circular motif is that it kind of insists on a way of life that's circular and coexistive instead of a very linear thing that Western narratives promote. The salt crystals are another key symbol in the Indian colonial movement. Salt was also banned amongst several other things. India usually used to produce their own salt. British rule banned the production of salt, which was interesting because it kind of collapsed the boundary between the personal and the political, because salt is such a key and mundane commodity that when you ban something that people use every single day, it brings in these political conversations into the kitchen. And the kitchen is such a feminine space that it also kind of politicized the idea of motherhood and caretaking for your family, which was really cool. Okay, my 4 key themes that I came through with my written inquiry were materiality and the semiotics of liberation, which central to this inquiry is an interrogation of how material culture operates as both resistance and historical record. The spinning wheel, which was long celebrated as a defiance of British rule, was not merely an alternative of production, but it was an embodied practice, entangling labor, gender, and nationalist aspirations. I'm critiquing a Eurocentric hierarchy here, wherein Western intellectual production, such as theory and textual work, is privileged over indigenous, non-Western forms of knowledge, which is craft and traditions and rituals. Which is why my written inquiry would have been incomplete had I not created a piece, and creating this would have been incomplete had I not written about it. To make is to theorize, and to create is to critique. By engaging with clay, an inherently processual and healing medium, this work underscores that knowledge is not solely linguistic or discursive, rather it is tactile and performative. The second key theme of my research is feminist performance in the politics of labor. Historically, anti-colonial movements look at a very masculinist narrative of battles and sacrifice and blood and warfare, but we don't look at what the margins do. It's like quiet forms of resistance from your home. I look at key South Asian theorists such as Gayatri Spivak, and she asks, can the subaltern speak? The answer to this is kind of complicated when it comes to the Swadeshi movement, because particularly those in the global south are written out of the popular narrative of history. So to answer whether they can speak or not is challenging, because whose idea are we looking at when we analyze the history of South Asian women? The third aspect is decolonial aesthetics and the politics of materiality. The ceramic reinterpretation of the spinning wheel extends this argument by demonstrating decolonial aesthetics as not simply representing indigenous symbols, but of engaging with the material. My fellow ceramic artists would agree that creating with clay is such a demanding process with patience and time, and there's so much of like yourself that goes into your work because you're very physically engaging with that. My perspective on this is physically engaging with anything should be a site of knowledge production, which is also what I'm trying to do here. Lastly, what lessons can we learn from the past to improve our activism today? For example, how can the practice of creating and crafting and material culture be used to disrupt these nationalist frameworks that are imposed on us? Civil rights continue to be eroded in many parts of the world, and it is essential to consider how grassroots, small actions of boycotting and creating and seeing where your money is going and seeing where it is coming from can be a form of resistance towards the hyper-conservatism and media sensationalism that's shoved down our throat. Finally, as Bell Hooks argues, the margins are not merely sites of exclusion, but of radical possibility. The act of making offers not just a means of survival, but language of defiance, an assertion of presence in the face of erasure. And this research thus not only historizes an era of creative resistance, but actively participates in the ongoing project of decolonization. It affirms that to create is to resist, and in the hands of the oppressed, craft is never just a craft. It is reclamation, revolution, and an insistence on a radical future. Thank you. Oh, questions?
So, I think the title of your show, Pressure Points, I think that's really interesting. I'm wondering if both of you would be willing to talk a little bit on where exactly you see these projects intersecting and where that title came from.
Well, yeah. As you can see, both projects are also crystal, and Nivi actually found this name. It has something to do with crystals forming at a certain. What was that explanation?
I was thinking of how, like, practically crystals form under like a lot of pressure in the kiln, but also what kind of art comes out when you're subjected to such censorship and pressure in terms of like, there's just like, I think Margot is like crystals on a side of pressure, and the way I'm trying to navigate pressure is more social theory based. So yeah. And then like pressure points. Motion, resistance, dynamism, movement. Yeah.
Margot, are these pieces like safe to eat out of?
It depends what you're eating, because if it's like a something liquid, it might over time dissolve the crystal structures. But if it's like something like a sandwich with bread, you're probably fine. I lined the inside of those mugs with a food safe glaze though.
Maybe could you talk a little bit more about the shadows that this was creating?
Yeah, I really liked how it's kind of leaving an imprint on the background work. And while this is more ornamental because I'm trying to focus more on this, the margins, I've kept the background very minimalistic. And practically, shadows were kind of unavoidable because it's a 3D piece. But then I kind of made it intentional by making the light sharper and not like so diffused. Because I like that it's an elastic impact. And the background really wouldn't exist without the shadows like on it. Yeah. It's also like kind of repetitive. It's creating way more circular forms than just this. It's kind of a ripple effect of like what you do and then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Quinn Hanna.
I'm Fitzgerald.
Bandit.
This is our show, Ends of the Earth. Hello everyone, I'm Quinn Hanna. I'm a ceramics major here at Ohio University School of Art and Design. I would like to welcome you to my BFA thesis exhibition, Pulling Threads. Since I was little, I've always been intrigued by the idea of being able to imagine something and then bring it into the third dimension. There's something about transforming an idea into something that I can hold that drew me to sculpture in the first place and eventually translated into ceramics. Throughout my life, I've always had struggles with clothing. Having sensory processing disorder has made my relationship with clothing very different from most people's. I find it is the most complex relationship I have to navigate in life. A tight cloth clinging against my skin, giving no room to move, is one of my biggest fears, and one that I must confront daily. As my daily routine starts with clothing my body, so does my frustration. When I started thinking about what I wanted to explore with my thesis work, my mind came back to the interest in bringing an idea or a feeling from within myself into the third dimension. I knew I wanted to find a way to communicate my experience with SPD through a collection of sculptural works, but was not quite yet up to the idea of direct self-portraiture. Over the course of my college career and being away from the cityscape where I grew up, I noticed I was a lot more prone to wildlife encounters living in Athens. I began really appreciating the little critters I would find on my walks to class and hanging around the studio late at night. I started to see moths pop up in my everyday life. I started researching Ohio moth species and was fascinated by their life cycles, especially their transformative instars. I found these different forms relatable in a way. A cocoon, a safe space, mirroring a baggy shorts and t-shirt that has become my life's uniform. A developed moth, their body completely free, without a protective outerwear. I see this as the epitome of vulnerability. Once I identified these parallels, I knew moths would be a successful substitute for myself in what essentially is a collection of self-portraits. In terms of physicality, I divided this exhibit into two parts. Fall semester was devoted to the moths, and the spring was devoted to the cocoons. The bodies of the moths were constructed with a mid-range porcelain using solid billet and pinching methods. The porcelain was fired unglazed and then blushed with a chalk pastel and sealed with an archival wax. The wings, made from handmade cotton paper, were pulled using custom molds for each of the 10 moth species featured. After drying, I printed onto the wings using a custom silkscreen featuring my own illustrations that were modeled after the moth's natural wing patterns, using embroidery and sewing motifs. The antennas were fabricated using unraveled yarn adhered to armature wire. As the cocoon forms, I started by coiling a domed form for the bottom of the piece and used a torch to dry the form so it could be flipped over and support the rest of the build. I then built the forms up using a paddle to shape it as it grew. After the first firing, I used a fine tip bottle to add the same stitching motifs used on the moths using white underglaze. The forms were then airbrushed with various glazes and refired. When installing this work, I wanted to emphasize the freedom of the moths by allowing movement and the rigidity of the cocoons by having their weight preventing such. As you move around the work, the moths move and appear to soar as the cocoons stay mainly motionless, almost as they are being held back by something. My goal with this exhibition was to find a way to confront my struggles from afar through substitute vessels. I wanted to make work that was digestible and aesthetically intriguing, yet also held personal experiences and importance. I hope that in viewing this exhibit, viewers have the chance to gain understanding about what life is like living with sensory processing disorder. I aim for the viewers to reflect on their own everyday routine and consider how this differs between us all. Thank you.
Get started. Hey everyone, my name is Fitzgerald. I'm a senior ceramics student here at Ohio University. I just want to welcome you to my show, Home by Dinner. Now, when I was about 18, I and a few of my friends went out for the evening, and towards the end of it, one of my friends asked me the question, what do I think my soul looks like? And I know that's a pretty big question and a pretty weird question. He was a writing major. I think that explains most of it. But I remember the answer I gave him. and it was not right. It was what I could think of in kind of my addled state. It's something like a big cave filled by its own emptiness, you know. It's real poetic, like kind of 8th grade type stuff. But that question is something I think about fairly often, and it's something that I try to answer, I think, in a lot of my work. It's, what do I think my soul looks like? And I think I can confidently answer that question now. I think it looks like a dinner table. Now, the dinner table, I know, I can hear everyone saying in their heads, a dinner table. Why would your soul look like a dinner table? And I say, no, wait a minute. I don't mean a dinner table as in a physical table. It can be that. But think of it this way. When you invite someone to the table, you're doing more than just saying, hey, come, sit down, eat. You're saying, hey, come here. Let's have a conversation. Let's have an experience. Let's grow together a little bit. I want to include you. And I think that idea of the dinner table, that's something that's really important to me. And that is something that I wanted to literalize with this show. Something I was thinking of was, when making this, was the dinner table isn't just, you know, it's not just the place you're sitting down and eating. It's not just what you're eating. It's not just who you're eating with. It's not just the stuff you're eating from, you know. It's not just that bowl that you got from your aunt 30 years ago, but you still keep around because you miss her. It's not just the bean soup that you made because a friend gave you that recipe a long time ago and you are not friends anymore. But it's good fucking soup. Am I allowed to cuss? I'm sorry. Okay. There's a lot of things that are tied to the dinner table, a lot of memories, a lot of the qualities that make us, us. And those are things that I wanted to set down in all of these pieces. A lot of the imagery that everyone's free to like touch stuff, by the way. Just feel free to pick stuff up and look at the images that are on this. I should say, materially, all of this is the same clay. It's kind of going to be arranged stoneware. But most of these pieces were fashioned after a classical Japanese style called the Oribe style. I think the thing that really drew me to that is it's very footloose and fancy-free. If you look up any traditional Oribe pieces, you see there's a lot of things that look kind of slapdash. There's a lot of these big shapes that kind of flow freely into each other. There's areas of glaze that look like they've just been slapped on there with not really a lot of consideration. But when you take the time to really sit down with these pieces, like eat, drink from them, you realize that these are calculated, that a lot of the kind of random imagery is coming together in a way that really makes the piece. And that was something that I wanted to use in this, because a lot of that imagery, a lot of that footloose and fancy-free motion, a lot of the, say the fish or the chickens or the little images of the garden flowing into each other, come together to make the pieces. They come together to make the memories that we ourselves are remembering or trying to make at the dinner table. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Bandit. I am a ceramics major, but I'm a multimedia artist at heart. I've always been a big fan of multimedia art. I used to be a painter in high school. That's what I'm known for mostly. This is my show, Pillars of Salt, Forward Flow. I'll read my thesis statement really quickly. Pillars of Salt, Forward Flow is centered around looking back, choosing to live, and releasing oneself to the flow of recovery. This show explores diminished self-worth spurred on by isolation and seeks to highlight my struggles with mental illness and dissolving support structure through one of the worst years of my life. As the people I care about most turned a blind eye to my pain, I spiraled into a thoroughly life-changing storm of OCD, depression, and anxiety. intention in showing off all my pain and loneliness that this has wrought is to illustrate what has led to my crisis. Sorry, read that wrong. My intention in showing all of the pain my loneliness has wrought is to illustrate what led up to my crisis and the remorse I feel for almost taking myself away from my partner and family. Suicide does not end suffering, it only passes it on to the people who you love. It took me too long to internalize, but there are people in my world, though they felt far, who want to see me succeed and are willing to walk beside me in life, no matter how sick I am. There is a story in Genesis about a family fleeing a city set to be smote by God for its wickedness. Angels came to the family in the night and warned them of the next day's destruction. As the spared family flee, one looks back and is transformed into a pillar of salt. She stands at the edge of the decimated town, stuck between the pain of the past and the safe future with her family. When I arrived at my breaking point in fall 2024, I spent an entire night researching whether my insurance would cover inpatient treatment or if I should follow the alternative. I didn't have the time or money to go to the psych ward, but I still held out a shred of hope that life would be worth living. So I closed my laptop, went to sleep, and continued going to work at school. As a Hellenic polytheist, I have a fluid view of the roles gods and such figures play in our day-to-day lives. In my interpretation of this Abrahamic myth, God represents reverence to emotion and the dominion it has over our bodies and choices. That being said, my focus is on the nature of paralytic memory and how her story is representative of the difficulties I have remembering the abuse and trauma I've endured. There are a dozen versions of myself frozen in my past. I've made the decision to live 100 times over, and I'm determined to move on and live freely as long as I'm able to. Now, I invite anyone who wants to enter here into this domain. And hopefully the camera can pick it up. So, first and foremost, there are two pieces on the floor over here on a pedestal. First, named filter feed, which is representative of my feelings living in a house full of people, but not being able to interact with them and not feeling safe to interact with them. And trying to find joy through overhearing their joy and feeling the gap in my own part in that space. Next to it is a piece called Motor Mouth, which is the first piece I made last semester. It's meant to invoke a feeling of throwing up your feelings, throwing up your words, not being able to control how you ask for help, and it falling on deaf ears. Above it is a piece called Starvation that I sculpted 2 years ago. It's representative of the beginning of my story of malnutrition. I have also you all came from it's a pretty luxury, but it's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder is a disorder often found in neurodivergent people. I have ADHD and autism. I do suffer with it. It's exacerbated by stress, and it has ruined my body. The dissonance between wanting to be healthy and not being able to be healthy is horrific, and I want this piece to represent the feeling of being stuck in the mud, trying to get better, falling in the mud, and not being able to get up. On happier things, there is a collection of pieces, which are all glowing on in a line right there, called Helping Hand. They are thrown by my beautiful, lovely, wonderful partner, Brian, and glazed by me. They're representative of the support that he's given me. He has been one of the few people this year who has stayed by my side and helped me dig myself out of that hole. Remember them? They're very deeply meaningful to me, and I can see his hand in each shape, in each form. onto the right, this swath of cups, bowls, mugs, all that stuff is called functionless functional. Meant to kind of be reflective of how I've spent my entire year trying to be functional. I've spent my entire year going to work, going to my 2 jobs, going to school, trying to be an active member of my family as it kind of falls apart, and trying to be an active member in society in my friend group, even though I was not healthy enough to. These pieces I'm very proud of. I'm very happy with the results. In front of them are pieces called Recovery, and alongside Recovery are Cool Finds. Recovery and Cool Finds are all pieces that my partner Brian and I found on a kayaking trip in Raccoon Creek in Newark, Ohio. We had a lovely, lovely day floating down the river, looking through things. There was a drought, so a lot of the cool stuff hidden under the water was revealed. It's just a lovely memory. And the glowing specifically is representative of how I've learned to soften my hard edges, and I've learned to heal myself despite feeling like a broken, discarded piece of ceramic. Which, on the note of glowing, glowing glaze is not common. It's not easy to make, and it's not easy to achieve. I've put a lot of work into quench testing, which means testing the various temperatures that glaze can show at, or that this glaze can appear glowing at. It was a difficult process to work through, but I did. I myself for that. Moving on to that piece. I think it speaks for itself. I almost took my life, and I feel great remorse for it. It was a horrible experience that I don't wish on anyone. The pieces below are all test tiles that I made during last semester, the time in which I almost ended my life. They make me sick to look at. They make me want to barf. So I put them in here because they make me feel something. Onto the paintings. Onto the forward flow part. I have been going to something called Spravato treatment, which is it's a depression treatment for treatment-resistant depression, which I suffer from. It's that piece specifically. All of these, most of those paintings are unfinished, which I'll mention at the end why. But it's representative of the fear and the singularity and the disembodiment I felt during a particular appointment, because it causes a very heavily dissociative experience that can be incredibly scary when you're dealing with it alone. And I've been doing that every Tuesday and Thursday for the past few months. That's why I was not in class a few months ago. These pieces called Neuron Connection are meant to represent me trying to let go, trying to find old hobbies, finding joy in oil painting again. Even though they're not completed, I'm happy with them. I'm pleased with the techniques I used. I'm pleased with the brush strokes and the attention that I paid to them, and therefore the attention I paid to myself. Towing the line is also a part of that neuron connection piece, sort of. Below that is my favorite plant, which has died. It was my pride and joy for months. I put a lot of work into growing it that long, and it is just another victim of my depression. Overall, the show is, as you can notice, kind of unfinished. There are blankets, tarps, exposed wood, unfinished paintings, all because I had to move out of an abusive household last weekend. And it was really rough. But I did it with my partner. We got out. I'm living with his family. It was a deeply transformative experience, something that I will not forget. Something that I hate that I had to go through, but I'm very glad that I'm stronger for afterwards. Yeah. pillars of salt pork fluff. That wasn't too rambling.
I have a question for Ian. Would you talk a little bit more about your fish bottles?
Yes. See, I thank you so much for this question, because you know how it is. You get up here and you think, oh, everything I was going to talk about. Ooh. That's actually another story. My grandmother, shortly before she passed, gave my father a decorative wine bottle. It was like cast in the shape of a fish. And I broke it when I was fairly young. I like shattered it. And, you know, it is what it is, you know? But I kept the pieces for a long time. And I wanted to remake those fish bottles because I feel like they're really representative of kind of the history of my family. There's wine is a powerful tradition, good old Irish family. And I wanted to take some of that into my dinner table. They are heavily reconstructed. I think the aesthetic is very much something taken from the bottom of a swamp. I really wanted to evoke age with these things.
So, oops, I'm sorry. I was just wondering if the pieces were included on the pieces of the old bottle were included, or what this material is here.
So a lot of that is a micro jade. It's just a kind of glaze. However, I'm actually glad you asked that once more, because I mentioned those shards of that bottle. I wasn't able to use a lot of it, but I ground it up and I used some as an additive in the glazes I've used here today. Also, a little bit of clay from my backyard back home. Took it, put it in there. You'll notice in some of these pieces there's blowouts. There's little areas of the bowl or the cup where it looks like there's part of a hole or maybe something was in the clay. That's impurities from what I had back home that essentially blew up, burned out, and killed me.
Quinn, I was just wondering, I've been very curious to hear about your color palette choices for your cocoons. Just between the light pink and the bluish purple, are those references to the body, or what was your thought process behind those?
Yeah, so my first rendition of the cocoon that I did back in August was super rainbow colored, and all it kind of just looked like a hodgepodge of colors, and it just was not super pleasing to look at. And the reason I did it back then was because I wanted it to really evoke this theme of a disguise, kind of over exaggerating this color palette to kind of distract from what's inside of the cocoon. When I saw that, and I was visually, it's just I don't want to look at that really. I started thinking about different ways that I could invoke this metaphor of this being a body, but it's a covered body. So I started playing with these kind of natural blushing to kind of invoke skin kind of coloring, and then the purple, similar things, we find these blues and pinks and these crimsons all in our skin tones and our joints, and I just wanted to kind of invoke that in more, and so that's kind of how I decide on that color palette. And then the moths, I wanted them to be kind of free from all of this color. So up until a couple weeks ago, they were just stark white, they had no any blushing or anything on them. So it was a high contrast between these ones that have all these colors between the folds of the cocoons and everything, and the moths. moths, so I wanted to add just like a little touch of this previous body into the moth so that you can kind of see that they're still related in a way. But yeah, you're correct, it's kind of to like come back to that, like the body and pulling those natural colors out.
I think it was really effective. I do feel that, like, I still feel that tension from your color choices, and yeah, I'm glad to see that you followed your gut with that. Thank you.
I have a question, actually. I don't know if we're allowed to ask questions, but it just made me curious. Why porcelain? That's a notoriously kind of difficult clay to work with. Was it just for color reasons?
I like making things harder for myself. No, the moths are porcelain. I really wanted to get this like stark white quality before I added the blush on them, and I knew the best way to do that would be with the porcelain. For the cocoons are actually a stoneware, and they have a porcelain slip on them, so they mimic the surface qualities of the porcelain, but really they're stoneware, so they're very strong and easy to work with.
Pretty intense installation. You all kind of have some intense installations, and you know, how do you feel the work is sort of amplified, or do you feel it's detracting, or how do you think of it differently in this setting than, say, as you're making it in the studio?
I would say that like my pieces themselves, like I was seeing which pieces I knew like were going to be successful, like after I would upload them from the calendar and I would, you know, evaluate them and like, oh, I like this. But I wasn't really until I got everything installed that I was happy with what my work was communicating. So I feel without this installation, or at least without multiples, like I really think they belong in groups, the cocoons and the moths together. I feel that this is the best way to view the body of work is all together.
I agree. I do think as well, like a group show, something that's really important is the rhythm. When someone comes in, what's their eye drawn to? How is that flowing out the rest of the space? And I do think that it really came together. I think really as you come in the door, your attention is grabbed by Quinn's. So all this light, everything, like your attention is poured into the stark white pieces, and then you kind of float down. Oh, this table, something interesting that's happening here. And then you look to your left and just see this big black space. I think that's really powerful. And I think that's something that really could only be done in a gallery setting as a group installed.
Something I kind of have built the concept around my pieces. It all kind of started with me wanting to do glow things and wanting to do things with the oceany theme. And as I worked on my thesis, it became about my thesis, and it became about my year instead of what I wanted it to be. I've been in the trenches. I've been living in the dark, like a little isopod or something, and having a dark space that is revealed and light is shed onto these very personal pieces of mine are kind of my way of forcing everyone to care in a way, but also accepting that people choose to open these and they choose to enter the space that I've created. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
I'm Chloe.
I'm Catie,
I'm Livi.
and this is our show, Intertwined. Gonna be good.
Yes, I'm starting. Hello, I'm Chloe Bidwell. I'm a painting and drawing major, and welcome to my thesis show, She's Still With Me. This body of work I've created this year is the depiction of the transition between childhood and adulthood, or more specifically, girlhood to womanhood. I used mostly personal experiences as inspiration for these pieces, but also wanted to create a sense of relatability amongst my viewers. I found that life is just layered experiences that form you into who you are, but the foundation of those layered experiences is childhood. In most cases, one's childhood doesn't end abruptly, but gradually. I believe that happens in more specific moments. I chose to display my work in a salon style because I think it helps the viewer see how those specific moments over time may overlap one another as well. The mediums I chose to work with include oil on canvas that has media or mixed media cut into it or pasted into it. The paper pieces include watercolor, paint pens, glitter, ink, sequins, gemstones, stickers, and found objects, all on watercolor paper. I would start with layers of watercolor, and then once I was happy with how it looked, I would go in with the paint pens and ink and everything to work on mostly the line work and outlining things, as I like to outline things in my work. And then I wanted the oil sections to kind of have a more adult feeling to it rather than a more childlike feeling with the watercolor, especially within these 4 larger paintings. The 4 larger paintings are and then the colors, like I mentioned, subliminal moments, like having your first period, which is down there, and then losing baby teeth or even shaving your legs for the first time. I created this character of my childhood self, and I wanted to do that because I wanted my child self and my adult self to interact with one another. First piece the of childhood. My dog's about to hit my inspiration pieces.
Sorry about that. Had a quick lost Wi-Fi. So we are back with Chloe.
I'm going to start with this piece. This piece is titled "You Can't Crawl Back into the Dollhouse," and it shows my child self trying to crawl back into the dollhouse, which clearly she could not fit. I was inspired by Shel Silverstein's poem, "The Dollhouse," which reads, "You can't crawl back into the dollhouse.
You've gone too big to get in. You've got to live here like the rest of us do. You have to walk the roads that are winding and new, but oh, I wish I could crawl back with you into the dollhouse again. I really love those poetry books and the illustrations as a kid, so when I rediscovered that poem in my adulthood, I thought it would fit perfectly in what I was trying to portray with my thesis. And then this next piece that I want to talk about is titled, "This Heart Ain't Big Enough for the Two of Us." This is another depiction of the worlds colliding between my adult self and my child self. As I was a very sensitive child, I would stay up late and worry about the future, as I do now usually, and I would end up waking up my mom and saying, "I'm too scared to grow up, I don't want to grow up." And she would, of course, my poor mother would have to console me in the middle of the night and tell me that it's okay and that I just had such a soft heart and that was okay. And I carry that with me all through my adulthood, and every time I think about things that are bothering me, I think it's okay, you just have a soft heart and that's okay. And then this last piece that I want to talk about is my personal favorite. It's what started the bunny hood motif in the depiction of my childhood self. One of my first memories was trick-or-treating with my dad when I was very, very little, and I was wearing a bunny costume. But we would not make it very far, as every time I was told to say trick-or-treat, I would start to cry and run behind my dad's legs and hide. Sadly, my dad passed away in 2018 when I was 15. And I would give anything to hide behind him again, but especially on hard days. But as an adult, you shouldn't hide and you can't really hide. And since he's gone, I couldn't hide even if I wanted to. This body of work illustrates the tiny moments that shaped my adolescence. And I hope you found a sense of relatability and that this has helped you reflect on your own transition between childhood and adulthood and see how it shaped you into the person that you are today. Thank you.
Are we golden? Okay. Hi, my name is Catie Perez-Strohmeyer, and I'm a senior BFA painting and drawing student. And today I'd like to say a few words about my thesis exhibition titled Two Women Touching. So, as you can see, Two Women Touching is really a collection of figurative paintings featuring myself and my partner Eddie. Ever since I started painting, I've always been really enamored with figurative work, and one of my earliest paintings was of a nude woman. It might be because I'm gay, but I don't know. I think I just like them. But as I grew older, I became way more aware of sort of the baggage that the female nude holds within art history. I'm also an art history minor, so when I was writing a proposal for my grant recently, I had the opportunity to really delve into this issue of what is the muse, what are the implications of the muse, and how can I continue my own artistic practice without giving into the sort of those trappings of how women are often portrayed in art and how they're often discarded by male artists. While I was doing that research, I read Francois Guillot's memoir, Life of Picasso, which pretty much confirmed everything I already suspected about male artists, but specifically Picasso. You may or may not know, Picasso was sort of notorious for being a womanizer and having a string of women from whom he gleaned a lot of inspiration and whose images are present in his art, but at the end he would tend to discard them and they would not receive the credit that they were owed from these male artists. But because I wanted to paint myself and my partner, I wanted to make sure that the women in my paintings, myself and her, were not depicted as being passive. They were not depicted as being laying coyly, waiting for a man to come and look at them and judge them and take stock of what they are. And there was a lot more work that I made when I started painting this year, and a lot of it began with domestic scenes featuring us, and they had a lot of detail with, house plants and stools and here's the bed. And all of that, but I found that it was distracting from what I truly wanted for this exhibition to look like. And so in October, I finally made this piece, which is titled Mutual Support, and it was the jumping off point for the rest of my thesis. As soon as I made this piece, I thought, yes, we finally have it, let's go. And the reason I say that is because it sort of honed in on the factors that I was really interested in capturing in my work. So the first of these is perhaps the least interesting, which is that I wanted to work with plain or abstracted backgrounds simply because I wanted the focus to truly be on us. I wanted it to be on our figures and not so much on the background and the setting, because I felt that there was somewhat of a risk of being amongst objects and transforming into one. So I wanted it to be very humanizing. And the second point, which is a bit more central to the rest of the works, is focusing on a shared action. So again, as I stated, you might be familiar with other famous female nudes, like for example, Ambra's La Grande Odalisque, and what comes to mind is a woman laying down and she's looking at you and she's very hot and sexy, which is all very good except for the implications. So in this case, my partner and I both suffered from a condition called having large breasts. And sometimes when we come home after a long drive or, running around and, in our Subarus and our, Carhartts and stuff, we have a bit of back pain. And so much like a pregnant woman might have her, baby daddy hold up her stomach to catch a break, we do the same with each other. And it's the least I can offer. So I sort of wanted to capture that just because I thought that it was unconventional. I hadn't seen other paintings about this behavior, but upon talking to other lesbian women, I discovered that this was not, in fact, my own invention, but something that was very common. So moving along, we're going in somewhat not chronological order of how this thesis came to be. This one is called Press, and it's quite a bit different from the other two that I will touch on, but it's the final painting I made in this series. And in this painting, I wanted to sort of move in a new direction for the rest of my work. And I'm graduating and I got to start making some other stuff. And I was really interested in leaning into a more painterly style and focusing maybe even more so on that action. So in this case, myself and Eddie are more anonymized, and you don't quite see our faces. However, I think that it really captures the intimacy and warmth and eroticism that I'm really interested in capturing in my paintings. And moving on again, we are back to where most of the work lies in this exhibition. This piece is called Metta, which is a Pali word for the Buddhist concept of loving kindness. My partner and I both meditate. We are both quite high-strung, but we find a lot of comfort in each other's presence, and we find comfort in tracking each other on Insight Timer and how many minutes have you meditated. But I think we really sort of embody that loving kindness towards each other, and I think that when you're in a space of that intimacy and that genuine care for another human being, there is no room for objectification. And because I'm not only functioning with a muse, I also am a muse, we are interacting in this special way. The focus is on us holding each other as we meditate. It's very calm, it's serene, and it's highly personal, and making this was very therapeutic, and sort of reflecting on my own spiritual practice that I share with her was also very therapeutic. Again, and sort of rounding things out, I wanted to focus on what is personally my favorite piece that I made in this exhibition. It's called Preen. Something that we often joke about are our ape-like grooming behaviors, which we also find a lot of comfort in. I think that this piece really sort of captures everything I wanted in this exhibition, which is that plain background, the focus on that interaction. There is an activity between us that is occurring. It is nude, it is erotic, but it is also imbued with just very strong lesbianism. There is a lot of body hair, which I was very excited to paint. I think that despite growth in lesbian and feminist art movements and more depictions of female bodies that perhaps people aren't used to, I still think that given the breadth of the male canon, there is a lot of work to be done. And I do think that having opportunities to create art where women are speaking for themselves, by themselves, and about themselves is still very, very important. I think that this piece really captures all that. It captures all of my main concerns. And I think that moving into the future with more work, I find a real opportunity to create more space for lesbian women and for women as a whole in art and in figurative painting, because I don't think that it has to remain an issue of objectification or humiliation. I think that figurative painting has such an opportunity for vulnerability and humanization, and I hope that I've captured this in this work and will continue to do so in the future. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Livi Hardin, and this is my thesis show, In the Company of Birds, a love letter to those who lift me. The idea behind this show was, in a big part, a huge love and admiration for the people who stood by me during the darkest times of my years here at OU. College is a struggle, as it is for everyone, I'm sure. And for the first 2 years, I didn't have the support that I do now when I struggle into growing up even further into my future career. I chose birds because while it is, I chose birds because I felt it was the easiest way to portray my family and my friends in a beautiful way and a very graceful way. This is In the Company of Birds. This is an overview of everyone that is important to me. Whether they have their own individual pieces or not, I wanted specific people with me and around me. I kept my animals as well because I wouldn't have the support I do without my ESA Coda or my little dog Pickles, who I got from my father. And speaking of my father, I created a piece that means a lot to me, more than the biggest piece in the show. This is titled, You Brought Me Up, You Brought Me Down, But I Will Always Need You. I wanted him to know that even though I'm growing up and I'm moving into the future, and that means moving away either to a different state, a different country, it will never come a time where I do not need him. And I wanted him to be a part of this and more than just a piece. He helped me create these frames by hand as something we could do together, because that is our way of connecting, is creating. So the next piece is You're Always Watching Over Me. I wanted to include my Pop and Nana, who have tragically passed away over a decade ago, but I remember times when I grew up in Florida, hence why they're herons, that those memories just stuck with me and helped me grow into a person that I was. I was a terror as a child. So I wanted to grow up and be a better person than the terror that I was. And I owe that a lot to them. And then this is for my mom. What would I have done without you? I'd say my mom is my biggest supporter in going into the art field. And so is my dad. But she really pushed me into going into the art field in a professional stance of going through college. We made a bet if I went to career technical school, I had to go to college and stick with it and graduate, which is what I think I am accomplishing here. I have this piece, which is Self. This is me. I chose the cardinal, the female cardinal, as myself because it is my grandma's favorite bird.
and it is also mine. And every time I feel down or alone, for some reason, I see a cardinal and I think of them. The next piece is the fun you bring to my life is so important to me. That is from my Aunt Doris. That is my dad's sister. She is the fun and whimsy of our family. She is a crazy crystal lady, and she has just been so much fun, and she's not like the typical family member. If I ever talked to her about something, she'd always be supportive in any way that she could. And as I'm moving away, I wouldn't trust my parents with anyone else to be by their side than my aunt. Because with my dad choosing a job that takes him far away for weeks at a time, and my mom being alone for the first time and not having me for support, I am so glad that they have my aunt to be there for them both. The next one is my brother, Drew. It was complicated, but now you're my best friend. Starting out, my brother and I are 10 years apart. We grew up apart as well, which led to a huge divide. Then he chose to live with us for a few years, and he became my best friend. Now we play video games as much as we can, and we stick together like glue. Even when I have to tell him he's got to do this or that and be an adult, he usually listens to me, and I'm so glad that I can be that support for him. And I wanted him to know that even though I am moving on to different states and everything, he can always talk to me whenever he wants. The next is always there for me. My best friend Maddie, who I met 2 years ago, really did save my life in more ways than she could ever know. I did not have many friends for 2 years in college, and when I met her, she helped me grow into this huge connection of her friends and then making my own friends down the line, and then we met other friends together, and it just kept growing, and my support and my branches kept growing. And that's what I wanted to buy with this. And then the last piece, it became more than just a job. I would say the best job I've ever had is here at Campus Cafes. I met some of my best friends here, and I wanted to highlight 2 specific ones, Jace and Morgan, because one of them I'm actually moving in with next year because of how close we got. And the other is just such a different personality than what I normally find in a friend. And I just wanted to thank him as well. And in making this series, I really just wanted to show people that even though it can be rough at times, you will always find your support. It could take years, months, weeks, hours. It doesn't matter when, you will find it, just like I have. Thank you.
I have a question for Catie. I was wondering if you had like any intentionality behind like purposefully rejecting the male gaze and everything that the male gaze is kind of deemed not worthy of like being attention, or like outrightly deemed gross, like body hair, lesbianism, body fat, like yeah, what was your thoughts behind that?
Well, I think it's less about, I think that sometimes we can sort of assume, similar to your framework where you're talking about existing on the margins, although I'm not super familiar with Bell Love, so I'll give that a sort of caveat. This sort of idea that certain people, perhaps men, perhaps, people who are white, people who are able-bodied, come into their politics and they then adopt it and they learn a framework, whereas I think that some of us who are born a certain way or who are, who are fat, who are gay, I sound like I'm bullying myself in high school, we sort of just simply embody this. And it's not until we grow up and exist in the real world that we realize that this is something that's rejected in the whole. And I think that really just sort of being exposed to a lot of different forms of media, whether it be going to art museums or seeing on social media or just sort of in advertising, sort of developing an understanding of feeling other. I think that it's important as artists to put more images into the world, and I think especially now we live in a very like image and video based society, so I think that art has such an important role to play. And you know, just naturally I happen to be a fat hairy lesbian, and that's what I like in other women and in my partner, who I love very much. And I think that both of us are so worthy of art to be made about us and to be honored in that way. And I would encourage everybody to feel and think the same things about themselves.
I had a follow-up question real quick about like media. Have you faced any like censorship with nudity and stuff? Because I know artists that paint the nude body have faced censorships on that. Like, have you just encountered that?
I have, primarily on social media. As we all know, the algorithm and the censorship industrial complex, the advertisers do not like the fat naked women, at least not outside of pornography. So on Instagram, I've had several posts be removed. Even surprisingly on Tumblr, which I thought was like, they're fine with the paintings, but I recently had press actually was deleted, and I've had my account sort of, you know, hey, I'm holding you hostage. And this isn't the first time with this show. I've also done other paintings that have been censored. And I'm sure that, you know, it's just the beginning. So, we'll see.
Is there a particular reason why you didn't frame these works? It feels like an expansion into the world. Is that the intended purpose?
So the honest answer is it was an act of stupidity and a lack of foresight, which is that I hate stretching canvases. I hate it more than anything on earth. And I just started, for me, painting is really just about like painting. Like, I don't want to be a carpenter, I'm not Jesus. And I just sort of stapling it to the wall, and I got super excited. I started going, and then it hit me. I was like, dude, I have a thesis. Like, I have to put it on the wall. I can't just pin it up there. And I work at the Kennedy Museum of Art, plug, and this is actually the mechanism how they hang their leavings in their Southwest Native American collection. No cultural connection to that, just happens to be how it's done. And so I sort of took notes from that, because by the time I was done with the paintings, they were painted such that there was not enough room to actually stretch them. And if I were to flatter myself, I'd say, well, I'm rejecting the paradigm that male artists have set up, that you have to have a stretched canvas or a frame or a museum, and instead I'm entering into the world of domesticity, and it looks like a tapestry or a weaving or some bullshit like that. But really, it's because I didn't think I had it.
I just, not really a question, but I just really like that you paired like not like glitter, but like rhinestones and like little things like based on the painting, like the attention to detail is really nice. Like this one about your dad has like sports themed ones as opposed to the rest of them are very feminine, and I just wanted to say like I love the attention to detail on the little thing. I don't know what to call it, but I like them.
Is there a particular reason why you framed all of your pieces with bare wood? I enjoy it a lot, personally. It's very reminiscent of a barn. It's kind of like homey and feels very familiar to me. I was wondering if that came from a place.
I chose to do raw wood because these are raw emotions. And I thought they would be just enough texture to pair with the illustrations themselves while also not being too much, or just white frame, white wall.
Is there a reason behind the texture? I really like the texture, the like, I don't know how to describe it.
The patterning. Kind of. I would say it was an unintentional detail at the time, but as I went through these, I kept thinking that this is kind of like dreamlike in a way. And so this is just kind of like how I see my brain on the inside. Is this like jumbled mess of anxiety, but through that, the calmness of birds.
So, I'm curious, was there specific reasoning that's not behind which birds are which people? Are there certain qualities that made you assign certain birds to them?
I anonymously went around and asked, hey man, what's your favorite bird? And I think that is kind of a self-reflection of who they are. I think the red-tailed hawk really does go with, get on the ground! The red-tailed hawk really just describes my dad in like this, it's a very like scary, piercing bird, but on the inside, it is a very actually loving bird. It takes care of its young very, very well. So that's a good reflection.
Are we in the clear?
Yeah, I called 911 accidentally, sorry.
Did you answer?
No. Apparently you pressed the
might-
side button 3 times.
They might call you back if they do. You should answer. It's a very exciting show.
Only hours.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Yeah. Yep. Thanks. Please join us on Thursday at 5 p.m. till 7 for the receptions. Thank you for tuning in online, and good night.